podcast where we bring you the history of the Axis powers unfiltered. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are joined by a very awesome and special guest, Dr. Moritz Fulmer. Dr. Fulmer, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, I wanted to ask a question. This entire episode is going to be based on your book titled Nazi Culture. What led you to write this book?
Yeah, it was one of these moments when suddenly someone calls you and invites you to write a book that you'd never thought you'd write. Because I had worked on the Third Reich, hence the invitation, but not actually that much on culture, never on theater, music, film. So it came a bit to my own surprise. And then I was thinking, should I accept that or should I just, apologize and say I have too much else going on? But what I quickly saw was that actually there wasn't a synthetic book, an overview of culture in the Third Reich that I would have found convincing. So I thought it is an opportunity to kind of bring together also specialized research, also for a non-academic audience, and also just think myself through key issues of the Third Reich, because culture mattered a lot to it. It was not just some kind of side phenomenon, some kind of extra on top of the material or military core of the Third Reich. It really genuinely mattered to its leadership and to a lot of Germans at the time. And that's what prompted me to actually write the book.
And ladies and gentlemen, check out the link in the video description below. It's going to take you to his book to where you can purchase it. It'll also take you to his academia profile to where you can really take advantage of the wonderful insights that he has to offer. And now we are going to jump into Nazi culture. As we begin, I want to go over some basic definitions. How would you, Dr. Fulmer, define culture?
Yeah, that's a difficult one because tons of cultural studies scholars, anthropologists, sociologists have grappled with that question. So I wanted to keep a low profile on the definition. But what I'm driving at is to look at high culture and take that seriously. The theater, the museums, the opera, the concert halls, that culture. To include popular culture. So that would be the films, the illustrated magazines, the radio programs, and so forth, but also see how culture was spoken about, what people understood by culture. Because if you only treat high culture and popular culture in isolation, then you don't really understand, for instance, its place in general society and its place in the politics of the Third Reich. Also, you would struggle, I think, to sort of come to terms with how it changed very rapidly, depending on the political situation before the war, during the war, in 1941, in 1944. Culture actually meant different things. So I didn't want to define it too rigidly, precisely because of its rapidly evolving character during the Third Reich.
So, when it comes to German culture and when it comes to a subject like Weimar culture, what would you say some of the main differences are?
Yeah, so German culture, as it evolved in the 19th century and had become closely associated with the forming of the German nation, had this idea of a mission, sort of culture really at the core of educating the people and of a sense of specific German genius for music, especially with your Bach, with your Beethoven. And a lot of that was actually continued after 1918. So Weimar culture is not categorically different. And what we often associate with it now is the modernity of the culture, the modern music, the various experimental films. So that's often meant by Weimar culture. But that's often an idea that was formed after 1933 in exile later on. And interestingly, you can also ask about Weimar culture. What about the town of Weimar, which after all gave it its name? And the culture of Weimar shows this divisions of Weimar, the town, because that had been the town of Goethe and Schiller, poets and playwrights around 1800, the nearest German equivalent to Shakespeare, the two of the pair of them. And so that heritage was still, taken very seriously. It is still taken very seriously to this day. And at the same time, Weimar hosted the Bauhaus, so the epicenter of modern architecture, of modern design. But because the extreme right got stronger, they basically sort of, in so many words, kicked out the Bauhaus, the school of architecture design, which had to relocate. So, in a sense, the town of Weimar itself epitomizes this sort of, that is itself was a point of contention. How, to what extent should Germany be open to new influences, to all that modernism had to offer, and to what extent should it remain faithful to its cultural heritage as it had formed during the 19th century?
I've always viewed traditional German conservatives slightly different from, let's say, the radical right group that many of us are going to call the Nazis. What would be a traditional conservative influence on German culture?
In the 1920s, you would think of let's say, a Beethoven symphony played by a provincial orchestra, of which there are many. Germany had, and actually still has, a very broad, also quite generously funded by international standard, high cultural landscape of partly also due to its origins in different states and different confident cities, which all had their own budget and all, wanted to have their theaters, their museums. So in a sense, in the 1920s, that would be conservative culture as opposed to, let's say, a modern interpretation of Beethoven, which also existed. Or it would be, Goethe, Schiller in a conservative production in a theater placed by these classics. That would be conservative culture. And that is in itself also not indeed distinct from Nazis. A lot of that would be played in the 1920s, would still be played in the 1950s and performed in 60s, almost to the present day. There are, of course, quite traditional classic interpretations of traditional classic plays or symphonies. So that the interesting thing is how the Nazis sort of put their imprint on that conservative culture and try to give it a sort of a specific twist.
We've covered what we think of when it comes to German culture. We've touched on conservative culture. My next question is now, when it comes to social democrats, you talk about them in your book. Would you say that they had any influence on culture at the time? And if so, give me an example of that.
Yeah. So, what would be typical of the social democratic movement, which, before the First World War was known as the strongest labor movement in the world? So, it was a broad, quite deeply rooted, quite confident labor movement. So, what would be their idea of culture? Their idea of culture was to certainly also to play the classics. They also liked their Goethe and Schiller and read them and make them accessible to the working class. That was the idea. But also, of course, the socialist songs that one would sing within at party gatherings, at the various associations, sports, and so forth, social democratic choirs. So that would be a blend of these. Now, did this have an influence in the Weimar period between 1918 and 1933? Certainly within that particular culture, think of maybe about 20-25% of the German population. And then more broadly, because they were the most important party in founding the Weimar Republic, they took a lead in liberalizing things, easing censorship, for instance, which means that a lot of things came out of that weren't necessarily products of the Social Democratic Party, but that were enabled by the loosening of censorship, the general sort of trend towards liberalization, opening up, allowing more things, certainly than during the First World War, but also more things than before the First World War under the Kaiser.
And now we're coming to the subject of your book, and that is National Socialism. We're going to jump into its influence and impact on culture. But before we get to that, I want to start off really basic for my listeners who may not be as familiar with the subject. And that is, would you define what was National Socialism and what was it a product of?
National Socialism was a product of a lot of different extreme right movements who were heavily nationalist, who tended to be anti-Semitic, who tended to think that the influence of Jews, which they vastly overstated, was nefarious and at the root of a lot of problems of modernity. Though National Socialists started out as a product of that, and one of many instances of not necessarily particularly original one, even where that played a role. And National Socialism also became then, during the 1920s, increasingly also defined by Adolf Hitler himself, because he assumed control over the party, sidelined competitors, and had the final say in the sense of whom to promote, whom to marginalize. That, for instance, the SS then later became such an important part of what constituted National Socialism, was due to the fact that Hitler gave them a lot of latitude, promoted Himmler and his followers. So in a sense, National Socialism became increasingly defined by one person and his quite very substantial influence over the definition of what this movement actually was all about.
In your book, you talk about how it can be very difficult to identify or define any genuine National Socialist culture. Would you mind expanding on that?
Yes, so I think in the Third Reich you have several strands and a certain uncertainty about what to do with culture once the Nazis had established their rule, which was pretty quick by 1933, arguably certainly 1934. Hitler's rule and the rule of his parties are very firmly established in German society. So what now? What to do with culture? So one strand was simply to carry on playing Beethoven, nothing particularly Nazi about that, and lots of other, even Richard Wagner, sort of was often associated with the Third Reich, but he had died 50 years before in 1883, and he had also non-Nazi admirers, even socialist admirers. So in and of itself, the content of that culture wasn't even necessarily that peculiar. What was then Nazi about it? Nazi was about to eliminate Jewish artists, musicians. Even imagine a provincial orchestra somewhere in the brass section. There's a couple of people who perhaps count as half Jews according to the criteria of the Third Reich. These people are kicked out, deprived of their living. Often we think, in thinking of the victims of the Third Reich, we think of very prominent people in the artistic world, or people who went into exile and then had a major influence for instance, in Hollywood. But a lot of people who, because there were so many provincial orchestras, so many provincial, theater companies, often their members were quite modest people without any particular originality. And the fact that these were sidelined, even if the content, what was actually played or performed, didn't change, is very important because it really mattered to these people. And some of these people ended up in Auschwitz, of course. So that's the anti-Semitism, just do pretty much the same thing, but eliminate all Jews who had anything to do with it, including film productions, that sort of thing. But then there's also this idea we need to do more than that. We need to do really something specifically Nazi. And the so-called thing plays that were sort of pseudo-Germanic. They had the ambition to hark back to a heritage of what was thought to be the Germanic tribes. These were not especially successful. They also, so the enthusiasm sort of petered out by about 1935. Though some still pursued a particularly Nazi agenda, particularly in Himmler's circles within the SS. That is the case. Some were actually not really keen on that, because the objective was, of course, also to use culture to win support, to sustain support, to not antagonize people with too extreme views or get on their nerves with constant propaganda, but just show them something pleasant, something to make them relax that will actually bolster support or sustain it. That was certainly the view of Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. That was just, say, always his sort of line was not to overdo the specifically extreme right stuff, because that is a minority thing. Just give people their Beethoven, give them a screwball comedy at the cinema, and then they'll be happy and sort of recharge their batteries to do their bit for the greater good of the Third Reich. That was sort of Goebbels' point. And concerning Hitler himself, Hitler was actually, in his personal taste, in many senses, were fairly 19th century. He liked Wagner, he liked Bruckner, a sort of late romantic composer. He liked 19th century sort of pretty Bavarian painters. Who are not, you wouldn't think of when you look at their paintings that, that anything to do with the Third Reich, not least because that happened 100 years before. But Hitler liked them, promoted them, collected them, so that also had an impact. What Hitler was really about, sort of in addition to his 19th century quite conservative tastes, was architecture, because architecture was a part where he felt you could makes a most lasting impact, because theater production or symphony production, that's gone after a while, but the architecture, and Hitler always thought of the Romans, that was still standing. So he thought, like the Romans, these buildings should still stand in 2,000 years time and be a sort of a lasting testimony to the greatness of National Socialism. That was the thinking.
In your book, you talk about the Third Reich presented itself as a contrast to life during the Weimar Republic, which many Germans, as you point out, saw as depressing. Why did many Germans have such a dark outlook on the Weimar Republic?
That's a very good question, because more historians are now arguing that the Weimar Republic, given the difficult circumstances within which it had to operate, didn't actually do such a bad job in providing a framework and doing the best they can, the politicians to deal with all the conflicts and problems to resolve. So why that negative image? It certainly had a lot to do with the fact that circumstances were shifting so rapidly during the Weimar Republic. Recall that this is just 14 and a half years. That's not such a long time. But you had hyperinflation during which savings just evaporated and actually were never compensated. You have had revolutionary attempts. Then you had about 5 calmer years, but just about 5 calmer years. And then you had the economic depression, which will be familiar to American listeners with an interest in history, but which hit Germany also early and really hard. So there was just this feeling that a perspective was lacking. For many, a sort of a perspective, both a stabilizing framework, and then many thought, why not a dictatorship? It might have dire consequences for those sent to a concentration camp, but that's not me. I'm actually, in a way, okay with that, because the overall situation is improving, and then things are looking up. There's a perspective now, which means that the Third Reich still didn't provide a very convenient, comfortable lifestyle for the vast majority of Germans, but it provided a perspective that things were getting better. that with a bit of imagination, and the Third Reich very heavily stressed that imaginative aspect, one could really sort of look forward to a good life within the Third Reich. And then, of course, the contrast to Weimar Germany was also emphasized by propaganda. So it made it look like pretty much a cultural cesspit, and also an economically disastrous time, time of political humiliation, and in a dictatorship where alternative media are increasingly difficult to even get, that has an impact if that narrative is sort of banged on about on a near daily basis. More people, of course, start to believe it.
One thing that you do in your book that I absolutely love, because it's no secret, if you want to understand history, you have to enjoy the primary sources that give us an in look into the time. And so, one thing that I loved is you bring up these letters that people had written back and forth on their views on certain things, like a play, for example. And I was wondering if you would mention some examples of Germans expressing their views on Weimar culture and the contrast of their view to the culture that National Socialism was creating.
Yes, yes, indeed. So what I found, I thought that I did not want to do, was to write a textbook. And if you write a book that's merely a summary that draws on a lot of specialized literature, it can often get a bit textbook-like. So what to do about it, how to prevent that from happening, is to actually include contemporary voices, also to make it lively, and also to include that dimension. What did people think about culture? Not just what do I define as culture as a historian, but what did it mean for people? And that you get by looking at letters and diaries as well. And just to give you one example, a woman by the name of Elisabeth von Gebensleben Alten, so long name, but imagine a woman in her mid 40s in Braunschweig, also known as Brunswick in English, a city in central Germany. And what, how did culture matter to her? So you see in 1930, 1931, she goes once to a performance of a play by Bertolt Brecht, who was an unapologetic communist, called The Three Pennies Opera, which was also a bit of a satire on class society and a bit of burlesque. And she said, "This is appalling. I'm sitting here and I'm appalled, but other people are applauding, and especially the Jews." Whether or not she was right, we cannot know, but that's how she perceived it. This is sort of an attack of her very German conservative notion of culture by a communist who is supported by Jews. That's how she saw it. And you then aren't surprised that she much preferred listening to Wagner on the radio, but you're also not surprised that this cultural conservative, who would under other circumstances maybe just pursued conservative tastes, becomes quite enthusiastic by the early 30s about Hitler, and is visiting a child of hers, a son of hers in Heidelberg, who's studying. Then she witnesses a kind of event staged by the Nazis with boats on the river they have there. And she says, "Oh, that's great." So she doesn't see it as a contradiction with her conservative tastes. Quite on the contrary, she feels that these people are finally willing to stand up to the Jews and the communists. That's how she sees the world. And then in 1933, she is, as you would by now imagine, highly positive about the actual seizure of power. So that's one example where you also see that she doesn't have a pluralistic understanding of culture. Okay, you don't like Brecht, you've made a mistake, maybe you shouldn't have gone to this, but so what? Then next time I will avoid him and go to something I actually like. That's a sort of pluralistic view, that not everyone has the same taste, and if you don't like something, you don't make the same mistake again, and that's okay. But that's not how she saw culture. Culture was for her integral to the German nation. So that's why she was so mad at this Three Pennies opera by the communists and the Jews, who supposedly were the ones applauding. I'd like to give another example to contrast that a bit, and that is more a diary. It is by Victor Klemperer, a diary which is, by the way, also available in English translation, but not for the Weimar years, for the Third Reich. It's available in English translation, but it's a German professor who has, in some ways, also quite conservative taste, but he does like film, but including Charlie Chaplin, entertaining film, and for much of the Weimar period, he's no longer that much concerned with politics. But by the early 30s, he becomes very aware that the extreme right is on the rise. He experiences it as his own university, and that they're anti Semitic students. And he says that even though he has definitely had German nationalist sympathies, these German nationalists will never accept me because they see me as a Jew no matter what I think or say. And then you see there in the 1930s how someone like that is excluded from culture, even in the most basic sense. In the end, also, he can't enter a library anymore. And that's banned. And that's for someone who is a professor of Romance literatures, basically spends his life with books. That's a very heavy way of being excluded because it mattered so much to him. Just like it mattered going away from culture proper a bit, that at some point Jews were also no longer allowed from having a driver's license. And he had driven, and that at a time when he really needed consolation because of all the anti Semitism surrounding him, he had enjoyed driving his car and which he had purchased as one of the fairly few Germans who could afford that at the time. But then his driver's license was taken away. So you can also see why a lot of things that we don't recall as the most drastic measures would typically not even feature in a history book because there were more important things than driver's license, perhaps, or access to libraries. But for him, that sort of crucially mattered. That really hit him very hard. And that sort of personal dimension of how anti Semitism was actually experienced. What did it mean for Jews, especially those Jews who wanted nothing more than to be good Germans? That really is conveyed by these more personal primary sources.
You've talked about how he felt seeing, things in his life slowly restricted. You touched on that in your book. Now I want to talk about how did marginalized groups like traditional artists and professors view the upcoming National Socialist movement? You had mentioned that many believed that they were being pushed out to the fringe of the Weimar Society in the 20s. And so I was hoping you could expand on that.
Yes. So if you take traditional artists in the sense of a traditional orchestra conductor, theater director, and so forth, or sort of a painter, and academics in the humanities, professors of German literature, of history, if you take these together for a moment, then we see that these were still fairly well funded on the whole and fairly respected figures in German society before 1933. So, in many sense, their marginalization was highly subjective. So, they felt marginalized, even though you could say they weren't really. But they had this idea, this claim to really cultural power and significance. And as that was challenged by, for instance, more modern art coming in, modern music coming in, and also having its audiences, by a market for literary products, for pamphlets, essays, and so forth, in which other people also wrote and claimed audience, and professors maybe had a harder time getting their views heard beyond the confines of their discipline. So that pluralism, in a way, was something they couldn't really stomach. And hence the tendency among both to actually greet National Socialism, because it did largely eliminate modern art. It eliminated people who were Jewish, people who were known as left wingers before 1933, which also essentially meant that they eliminated some competitors. So even a professor who wasn't necessarily an anti Semite before 1933 might still have quite appreciated this this sort of that some competitors were sort of sidelined, that he was now rid of people who wanted the same professorship because these happened to be Jewish. So that also, and this idea of a mission. Now we have a mission again. Now culture means what it should mean, or the humanities means what they should mean. That doesn't always mean that there were no disappointments, because some academics who wanted to play a role, to be the philosopher of the Third Reich, or to be the legal thinker of the Third Reich, were actually sidelined by the mid-30s. But that's not something they knew in 1933. So you find a lot of people quite eager to participate, to play their part, to claim a role within that new regime in 1933. So it's not all imposed from above by a small group of party members, quite apart from the fact that by that time there were already a lot of party members. That was and a lot of people who had voted for the Nazis before 1933. So it's one part of German society sidelining some other part, but a good, let's say, the third part, to simplify that a bit, happy to jump on board.
And before we move on to German society itself, I want to touch on one more thing, and that is foreigners and their views on German culture. What were some of the views that foreigners had on German culture before and during the Third Reich?
So, what I was, what I had known before, but was still struck by, is that when writing this book, is that there was a huge amount of respect for German culture. These composers were played widely internationally. Many artists were admired internationally. And there have been lots of connections as well. At the time, English wasn't the natural second language across the board, as you increasingly are seeing it now, for European intellectuals or people in culture. You'd have many Scandinavians, many Dutch who had really good German and were looking primarily to Germany. So that was a huge respect for German culture. And even after 1933, you often see that. To give you one example, Wilhelm Furtwängler, who was the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic, not a Nazi of himself, but someone who in the end became a cultural figurehead of the Third Reich and who by and large went along. And he was sort of widely applauded when playing in Paris in, I believe, in the late 30s at some point. So that meant that the Third Reich could draw on this cultural prestige. Then there was also the distrust since the First World War, when Germany had occupied large parts of Europe, northern eastern France, Belgium, parts of Eastern Europe. This idea of then Western French, British, American propaganda, the Germans speak of Kultur, they like their Kultur, but what they really mean is a cover up for brutal rule exploitation. That, of course, that distrust was there since the First World War, and then, of course, again activated during the Second World War. And then, of course, among in the left-wing part of European public, there was sympathy for the anti-fascists and their culture. Only that these people, when in as much as they made it to exile, often had a limited influence, linguistic limitations, lack of money, of resources, and so forth. So they tried to mobilize European, even global opinion against the Third Reich by pointing out how dangerous Hitler was, by sort of fooling the anti-fascist imagination, but that was at best a qualified success. And then, of course, during the Third Reich, everything changes with the Second World War, because then the Third Reich is not just a country that you can visit and perhaps still enjoy, as did John F. Kennedy, for instance, who quite enjoyed his visit to Germany, but it's a country that actually occupies, that has, even in the parts of Europe that it didn't occupy, it often had a strong influence, for instance, on the film market, with an attention to eliminate the predominance of Hollywood. And then there was this idea in 1940, 1941, when the Third Reich looked very strong militarily. There was all this idea that's a new reality. Whether or not we like it, we need to adapt ourselves, get used to German predominance in Europe. They're holding all the cards at this point. And you find also intellectuals who are quite happy, French intellectuals, Norwegian intellectuals, who sometimes get invited to a big conference, again in Weimar in 1941. So they're quite happy and think, isn't this better than the American influence? Isn't that better than the French influence? There was sort of some, still during the war, some cultural prestige to draw on for the Third Reich. But when it became increasingly obvious that the Third Reich was really not about recognizing other countries, appreciating their contribution, it was about exploiting, robbing as well. If you think of all the art looting, they essentially just went to museums and took away the stuff. And of course, that disappointed also those who would have been open-minded to a German predominance once they felt that reality. And then also the military prospect shifted. So by 1943, 1944, you see, of course, a tendency to distance yourself among Europeans from the Third Reich, which now looked like a losing party, and its culture. And also increasingly voices that didn't feel much longer like distinguishing between German and Nazi culture said, maybe that German culture is a problem altogether. And we should sort of really now demarcate ourselves from it.
And now we come to our aspect of this talk when it deals with German society. When it comes to the average German, before and during the Third Reich, what was their living situation like?
Yeah, to generalize, of course, very, very crassly, you see before the Third Reich, sort of coming back to my point before, that things so rapidly shifted, that everything was so unstable, which means that the situation could have been very different in 1928, better than in 1923, but then again, much worse in 1932. So that was typical, this experience of instability. And during the Third Reich, before the war, you saw this idea of things are picking up. Let's say, not for everyone, but for especially those who played a role in armament. That meant workers who were typically young, quite willing to move elsewhere, often could find well remunerated work, prestigious work in one of the new airplane factories, typically more central Germany, to the east of Germany. If you are prepared to move there and do the work that was open to you, you could really also earn more. Some of these cities grew. Or this general feeling of being part of something greater. This idea that the Third Reich, I think, appealed to the desire to be ordinary, to just have your job, your life, and unemployment did go down after a bit, even though wages did stay and salaries did stay modest, but things were picking up. So that's the ordinary part for people who just wanted their peace and quiet. But there's also the extraordinary part. You can be part of something fabulous, something great, a nation renewing itself, getting out, making a stand in the international theater. And that too appealed to many people. And in some cases, both. So both ordinary and extraordinary elements, both a desire to be normal and a desire to be special. Both would be appealed to by the Third Reich. And generally, not just the Third Reich is in the end isn't so much about reality in the material sense of how much money do you earn. Of course, that mattered, but it was principally about an imaginative quality. What world you thought you were in. What do you think were the perspectives, the sort of utopian idea, the future looking character of the Third Reich? And so that appealed a lot, this idea that the imaginary quality suggests that you're part of something good in the end. And that it's striking, also sometimes depressing, how many Germans essentially fell for that, but it's something we need to face when thinking about the history of the Third Reich.
And as you talk about the Third Reich basically creating this new reality, how did racial fantasies play into this reality?
Racial fantasies were fooled by the Nazis, and especially the anti-Semitism. Not all Germans even cared so much about Jews, which doesn't mean even those with some prejudice wouldn't necessarily be as obsessed as the typical party member. But the party members, that was millions of people, or people who were part of one of many Nazi organizations. That was millions of people that they had the power to push their anti-Semitic agenda. And the idea was always that Jews were associated with the Weimar period, but even at a time when objectively Jews were already sidelined. By 1935, even 1934, no Jew holds any position of any power anymore. They're out of the banks, they're out of the insurance companies, and so forth, and certainly cultural life. So then this idea comes, how then fool the racial fantasy further, and on what grounds, if so-called the perceived problem had already been solved? This idea that Jews were agitating against Germany from everywhere, because Jews, according to an anti-Semitic worldview, were communists as well as capitalists. They were in Moscow, in London, in New York, the finance people, in Hollywood, in the film industry, and they would all gang up against Germany because the idea, the racial fantasy, is that this race has a cohesion, that it works together, even people who have never met, who have very little to do with each other, who don't speak the same language, but because they are Jews, they act in unison, and that's a racial fantasy about it. There's also, if you look at the SS, especially the sort of positive side, if you want to even call it like that, of this racial fantasy that the Germans have these racial roots and they can be uncovered by doing the archaeology of Germanic tribes, of reconstructing their languages. Lots of funding went to that, of course, to the delight of the academics who could conduct these research projects. And that too was this idea that what this race was, what the precise criteria were, that always remained vague. But this general idea of again, going back to the point of being part of something greater. But certainly the racial fantasy, in a sense of fantasy of being threatened, that principally applied to Jews.
And so now we approach the aspect of our talk on Nazi culture itself. How did Nazi culture change from, let's say, 1933 through 1945?
Yes, there were always, as I've mentioned before, these strands that were not particularly Nazi at all, and that were conservative in a 19th century tradition, or that were part of a 20th century popular sort of entertainment-oriented culture, just film comedies, romantic dramas in the cinema, illustrated magazines. A lot of that wasn't not necessary. You would sometimes struggle to identify that this was actually made during the Third Reich. But again, there are phases in which strong interest is pointed to the necessity to do more than that, to make more of a statement. In the late 1930s, let's say 1937, 1938, the anti-Semitism was certainly reinforced. It's very strong in the famous exhibition on so-called degenerate art in Munich in 1937. There was a parallel exhibition nearby on great German art, but Hitler and Goebbels were actually not that pleased with all these peasant scenes and these voluptuous women. That was perhaps the closest to come to a Nazi definition of visual art, but they were actually not that happy. What they stressed was the negativity, the degeneration for which, of course, Jews were blamed. So that was reinforced in the late 30s, and the public architecture, which was sometimes planned before, but of course architecture takes a couple of years to materialize, there you really have the famous sort of buildings of Even though if most never got completed, some were, and it had a huge impact of this idea of really making a statement. For instance, the chancellery where Hitler resided, that did get finished, of course, was treated with priority, with sculptures, sort of that look by Arno Breker and architecture by Albert Speer. That comes closest to a genuinely Nazi culture. Then again, big change, Second World War, because it was so tied to the imperial project. And partly that's, again, the culture is quite conventional, but it's now played in occupied Poland as a sign of, even though the culture might have been mediocre, a mediocre production of some play, but it was always kind of vaunted by the propaganda as a sign of German superiority over the Polish race. Or in France, it was also heavily promoted. There, more respect was paid to French culture. One didn't want to alienate them all. But this idea was also exhibitions promoting theater, music production, promoting the superiority of German culture. Film marked because of the could be controlled by, for instance, not by saying no French films could be shown. In fact, quite a few were made during the Second Reich, but no pre-war film with any Jewish contribution, even the last extra, so to speak, all had to go. And that, of course, boosted German productions as well. So that imperialist character, during an openly imperialist character, which was already there, had been there before 1939, but really now came to fruition during the Second World War. And then towards the very end of the Third Reich, to take the chronology a bit further still, it's, of course, a culture of catastrophe. It's the theaters are being bombed. The cinemas, you can make up a makeshift cinema that's easier than a concert hall and still show films. But increasingly, the last concerts of the Berlin Philharmonics, a flagship orchestra, have to take place elsewhere because the main concert hall has been bombed. Then Goebbels protects the artists from military service because he thinks that art is so important. So that was a major advantage of being an orchestra musician, a theater actor, not to have to do military service, but that's revoked towards the end. So very little is still there from the once proud culture of the Third Reich. So it becomes part of this disaster scenario, also of that urge basically to drag the entirety of Germany down, because there was no compromise after the Holocaust, after all, no compromise possible any longer. You could only die or experience defeat in death, really, or perhaps still hope for a final victory. But that was an increasingly elusive prospect. So I would say that's why it's so hard to generalize, because culture in the Third Reich changes so much. These are only 12 years, mind you, but within these 12 years, there's several major shifts. 1933 is different from the mid-30s, and late 30s are different. And certainly, even that is a simplification, but certainly two major stages within the Second World War. And that's part of the Third Reich, because it has such a dynamic, such of a horrible dynamic, that it really creates different situations within just a couple of years. And stunning, also many contemporaries, many observers sort of struggle to make sense of it all because of this rapid change. And observers in exile who were perhaps, somewhere in New York, or they were remote, of course. They could have access to all the press, but they didn't really see the inside dynamics of German society because they were away or have been away for years. So actually, it was very hard to make sense of it all for pretty much each and every contemporary. And that's one of the Third Reich's sort of ferocious qualities, to create this destructive dynamic.
And so now I want to touch on a subject that we call violence. How central was violence in Nazi culture? And while we're at it, we know they would attack political meetings that were expressing political views that were rival to their own, attacks on Jewish businesses, for example. But we also have the Night of the Long Knives. And so I want to ask, how central was violence within Nazi culture, and how did many Germans view violence within this culture itself.
Yes, sort of, if you sort of accept that culture in the Third Reich is broader and a lot of it is not specifically Nazi, but if we then focus on what was specifically Nazi, then violence is indeed quite central. And I think a good starting point is to recall that stormtrooper violence before 1933, where they would bust up political meetings or would just parade through a small town just to demonstrate their power, that they would now march in orderly fashion, but they could explode into severe violence at any point. It was up to them and their power to decide whether or when to do that. That was also a spectacle. And that's a cultural aspect of it. It had a sort of, it had a choreography to it. It had its own flags, of course, a swastika flag, first and foremost. It had uniforms. So it was also created to make, they sang songs, was created to make the impression by way of spectacle. And that's, I think, the cultural aspect to stormtrooper violence, which of course has other aspects as well. And after the Third Reich, part of that culture was also to drag Jews through a small town, a Jew with a board around his neck saying, I slept with an Aryan woman. And people applauding, sometimes looking skeptically, but also often participating in the dragging along. And that also had a spectacle character that was central, and that even before the pogrom, so-called Reichskristallnacht of November 1938, that took place very often in smaller places, where the correspondents of the foreign press, they would be in Berlin, they wouldn't be in these smaller places to observe and report. But that sort of was a major part. And the Night of the Long Knives, obviously that was more secret. That's not an openly displayed violence because there were no spectators when these about 80, 90 opponents or putative opponents of the regime were executed during that night. It was also a convenient way of getting rid of people one wanted to get rid of. But I think sort of the fact that this was later openly admitted and justified, including by the foremost legal thinker of Germany, Carl Schmitt, who said the Führer protects the law. So basically, the most blatant violation of the rule of law that you can even imagine was justified by the foremost legal thinker as superior form, or as a superior form of law. So I think that has a cultural aspect, and important cultural aspect, the fact that the main stormtrooper, the stormtrooper leader, who then went from a friend of Hitler's to his competitor and didn't really grasp the risk he was taking in doing so, was known to be homosexual. That was also played as a sort of homophobic, anti-gay narrative that, of course, also has a cultural side to it.
You've talked about how a lot of investment was put into really studying the German past, trying to recreate the German language from the ancient world. Archaeology was invested in. And so my next question is, what role did history and historiography play in the Nazi world and its culture?
History was a very important justification because the Nazis placed themselves grandly in a very large time span. And what time span that precisely was, that differed a bit. For Himmler, it was always the Germanic tribes. Hitler himself wasn't very much into that. He was more into the Romans, and that was his continuity he emphasized. But what did matter in both cases, either way, what did matter is the idea that it's really about thousands of years, and that looking to the future, this new Third Reich would sort of persist or be positively remembered like the Romans were. That sort of this thinking in long time spans that made history important. Also, history was important to justify the claims on land that was actually Polish at the time. Or Czech as well, part of Czechoslovakia, how to sort of justify kicking out the population living there during the Third Reich, creating room for ethnic Germans. And that was often justified through history by claiming that always been a predominant German influence and perhaps a nefarious Jewish one, so that it would logical and perfectly moral to actually rectify that, to go back to supposed origins. And quite a few serious historians at the time participated in that endeavor. And it was a bit of an embarrassment when it came out much later or was debated that actually they had played a very prominent role in the profession of historians in West Germany in the 50s, 60s, even 70s. And then their sort of Nazi era activities were then at some point, brought to the fore and led to quite a bit of debate within the profession. So I think that's where history matters. It gives people a sense of belonging to something greater and than just the present, the past, then of course the future, by implication, to sort of have a particular way of remembering the 19th century and say Hitler takes it to another level, what Bismarck did, never mind that Bismarck was actually operating in a very different context, but that didn't necessarily matter to such a partisan history. Or that, of course, core claim of history that Germany had been unfairly treated after the First World War. That claim was also, a lot of historians spent much time, spilled a lot of ink bolstering that claim.
And so before we move on to anti fascist culture, I had another question. You had brought up how, there were certain instances in which, for example, a public spectacle such as a Jewish man being dragged through the streets, other more of a, almost like a Renaissance medieval style pseudo history reenactment of, parades trying to remind Germans of an older time. How influential were public spectacles and how popular were they? I imagine that towards the end of the Third Reich, they probably became less common. But in the end, how overall popular were these public displays?
The most So if we sort of stick for a second to these parading of supposed opponents, supposed racial opponents like Jews, but also in 1933, right during the seizure of power, political opponent, just a sort of a very not non-radical, moderate social democratic mayor, for instance, that type of sort of functionaries often also dragged through the streets. There are a lot of sort of instances of that where that too is part of the spectacle of the seizure of power. And going to the sort of positive side, what was the attractive about these spectacles beyond showcasing and exclusion of enemies? It was certainly this idea of doing something special, of being part of something special, great celebrations, with the slight problem that these sort of things tend to wear off. But it was mainly, I think, most important for the party members, and that's not a small group. So that's already before 1933, that's well over 1 million people, but that grows after 1933. So these Nuremberg party spectacles, which are also turned into documentary, if one can call it like that, by the famous or infamous film director Leni Riefenstahl, Triumph of the Will. And that's a documentary about the 1934 Nuremberg Party rally. And that's not just for the people who were there, but it's also via such media products as, of course, the messages spread into all the cinemas. So that, I think, was very important for this sort of idea that the party members need to be reinforced in their belief that this is really crucial what they're doing. This is really part of something great, because their activism needed to be fooled constantly, renewed when it got a bit tired. This idea that you could never let that down. New spectacles, for instance, a spectacle in Munich, which basically emphasized all kinds of historical reference, paraded people dressed up as Germanic members of Germanic tribes, or dressed up as Romans or Greeks, that sort of thing. If you add all that, it was a big part. And then during the Second World War, of course, a big problem is that it could no longer take place, or hardly. It was much harder to do. Certainly not by 1948. It basically stops taking place. And that certainly was also a problem. That's this big public spectacle could no longer really draw in people because for the simple fact that that wasn't possible to do anymore.
And so now let's talk anti fascist culture. What is anti fascist culture, and could you give us some examples of a pushback to Nazi culture itself?
Yes, so anti-fascist culture was part of a left that partly communist, partly social democratic, but a lot of unorthodox left wingers, somewhere between splinter groups, socialist splinter groups, and united in their opposition to fascism. That's why it's called anti-fascism. These people were so brutally marginalized, so brutally also put into concentration camps, driven into exile, to the surprise of many observers, because this had been an extremely strong labor movement, and but they weren't prepared for that kind of degree of violence. That just stunned them, and they didn't have the weapons, the training one would have needed to resist that. So it's for that reason it's very different from, say, the Spanish Civil War or something like that. It's a very different basic situation. So how was pushback possible? Well, often it was hardly possible. That could mean in a concentration camp or labor camp where lots of these socialist types were sent, to just sing a song from the good old days or just draw something very private way of maintaining some kind of cultural activity by doing drawings, writing poems, all these things. But these always had the problem that they could no longer reach a public. They were private activities or perhaps small group activities at best. But outside the concentration camp, the risk of denunciation was simply too big. So, and if a group of, say, 10 people sang old labor movement songs, that may have consolated them, but it didn't have much of an impact beyond that group. And to go do more, that was tried, but very often ended in imprisonment by way of denunciation. Someone denounced them, and the Gestapo got on the case, and that was it, really. So the pushback was attempted from abroad. In Paris, for instance, in Prague, also Zurich, Switzerland, Amsterdam, where before the war, sort of these exiled Germans gathered, and they did have their journals. They did try to, organize events. They partly found new publishers, and but that also they struggled to have a wider impact, mainly because at the time the consequences of Nazi rule for Europe beyond Germany's boundaries weren't so clear. So Hitler made assurances of peace, of peacefulness, so that he didn't really want a war at all. And a lot of people believed him because it was also cleverly conveyed, that lie. So it was hard to just say, okay, here's a brown book, which they did, of what is really going on in concentration camps, sort of an account of all the horrific treatment, to really get the kind of motivation they would have needed for an earlier military intervention, which of course spared spared the Second World War, because Germany wasn't that strong militarily in 1935, but France, Britain were in a sense uninclined to go that far. You then have an American exile during the Second World War. You then have partly collaboration in a sort of a Hollywood culture that becomes quite anti-fascist, or has really anti-fascist films. Alfred Hitchcock does that, but sticking to Germans in exile, Fritz Lang, famous, probably really most important film director of the Weimar years. It is a bit unclear. 1933, it's not quite sure what to do. Maybe he could continue. Goebbels actually would have liked him to stay, but he doesn't. He does go to Hollywood, goes a bit of back and forth, but ends up in Hollywood. And then he does a couple of anti-fascist movies during the Second World War. It becomes part of that effort to mobilize against the Third Reich. So that was, in a sense, their pushback, or the best they could do in terms of pushback. I think that would be the adequate way of putting it.
As we approach the end of this talk, I want to talk about denazification. When the Third Reich fell, what processes and practices were put into place to denazify Germany? And in reality, how do you de radicalize a population, and especially a youth that has been heavily indoctrinated?
Yeah, that was a huge challenge. And especially if you come, as more and more voices did, from Moscow all the way to Hollywood, if you come to the conclusion that it's not just the Nazis, it's German history, it's German culture that is somehow to blame, then what do you do after the war? Because you can eliminate the Nazis, but you can't eliminate everyone. So you have to be, in a sense, or more pragmatic. That was at least the conclusion drawn. And what you get is a lot of that respect for German culture. So let them have their symphonies. There's nothing wrong with that. And even we quite like to go because we respect that. Their Beethoven and so forth. They're great writers of the 18th 19th century, though actually the Russians respected that too. A lot of the Russian occupiers were quite respectful of German culture. And then in the Soviet zone, later the East German communist regime, the GDR, German Democratic Republic, in the Opera House in East Berlin, quite classic fare, conventional fare was mostly offered. So I think that was a way to say, let them have their German culture, but draw them away from the Nazi part. And that was, of course, through a certain censorship, through also denazification in the sense of trials, putting people on trial. And that didn't touch a lot of cultural people, but it generally was a signal to keep quiet if you still had openly Nazi views. So the allies, and these most importantly the Americans in West Germany, were, as it turned out, okay with former Nazis playing a role in cultural life and social life, political life, in the administration, for instance. And they felt, they lost the ambition to really denazify across the board, but they were not okay, and they made that very clear, with anyone still openly coming out with Nazi views. And the radical right party that existed in the early 50s, that had quite an upsurge, sort of neo-Nazi party, was actually banned eventually. So that was basically the deal. You could be a former Nazi if you gave up your former views, or at least pretended that you had given them up. I think that's most important. And there's now quite a bit of discussion, because it turns out that modern art, modern music of the 1950s, among the people who organized that, the major festivals or exhibitions, quite a few had been party members, and for a long time that had not been recognized or not been found out. And now there's a debate, but I think that's quite typical of the time. But that was the deal, essentially. If you had been a party member, okay, just keep quiet about it and carry on, as long as you do something else now. So that's basically the deal, and that's how I think it touched on culture as well.
After almost, and it's crazy to think about it like this, my grandfather and my uncles all served in the Second World War. And, I knew them as a child. And so the fact that the World War II is almost a century ago is just mind boggling. And so my question is, after almost a century since World War II, are there any remnants of Nazi culture today, or are there still echoes of the Third Reich?
Yes, in Germany, that will never entirely go away. And I think that would be a wrong or mistaken expectation. We no longer have any contemporaries, or save people who were born at the tail end of the Second World War, and so we don't have, or maybe these last people are still apprehended who played some role in concentration camps, but those are exceptions. Most of all, importantly, we are no longer in the period where the contemporaries who had lived through that period were among and around us. That's over. And also, some quite controversies about individual people. For instance, I have mentioned before this conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler, not a Nazi, but certainly happy to play his role in bolstering the cultural prestige of the Third Reich, and then still active in the 50s. I think a lot of increasingly in Germany, people wouldn't even know who that was. So in a sense, these controversies have become less important because these people just ring less of a bell. And I could name other examples that are just not as prominent as they used to be, even back in the 80s, and have now sort of basically not just become less important by virtue of becoming less known. But we do often have glimpses. We have sometimes these in modern art, in modern music, then these cases. What do we do when it's found out that one of the founding fathers of that festival in the 50s actually had been a party member? Sometimes art is found somewhere, or sometimes it's in the press that Arno Breker, the Nazi sculpture, something has, or Torak, the other one, something has been found that thought of being forgotten. Then the art looting, that also comes back because that raises issues of restoration. There's still art in museums that has effectively been robbed by the Nazis, how to trace that, how to make sure that connections are really established, and then give it back to their rightful owners. So these are instances where that actually still plays a role in popular culture, of course. That's not just in Germany. Members of Quentin Tarantino's movie, the Nazis are always a reference in the Third Reich, and Hitler a reference in public culture. In popular culture, for that matter. And then we see now, with the rise also of a radical right in Germany, that perhaps the thinking of the extreme right in certain circles of society has never fully gone away. And this idea that Germans are a race, that they have thousands of continuity, however artificial that may be. There are people genuinely believing in that. That the Third Reich was there, they're undecided, partly something to admire, partly something to sort of claim was never that important, or has been peripheral to German culture. So in that sense, these are several examples where you would say that even with all the time that has now passed, the Third Reich and its culture are still with us on some level. And that I find also interesting, this idea that something doesn't necessarily go away just because there are hardly any contemporaries left who had actually witnessed that period.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us at the Axis History Podcast, to where today we've explored the Third Reich, Nazi culture, and the German people. Dr. Fulmer, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.